I apologize for the name, Scientific Computing Institute. I recognize it's Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute. And I also apologize for the technical errors. I'm actually going to be loading up my demos while I'm presenting, so forgive me if I'm a little bit distracted. So I'm going to talk about analysis-ready domain models of, or analysis-ready models of complex domains. The motivation of the project is our larger neuronal modeling project that we have at UT Austin with various collaborators. And the idea is when you go to Wikipedia, you look up brain neurons, you're going to see an image much like you see in the top left. Something probably from light microscopy, and you see these long branching structures coming out from what's called the dendritic, or the neuronal soma. And then you have these axons and dendrites coming out like these long protrusions. But if you zoom way in, you can see in the little red box, you zoom into there, in the large red box you see a dendrite, a spiny dendrite. These are dendrites coming from the hippocampal region of the brain, which is responsible for learning and memory. And you see that these dendrites are anything but smooth. They've got these, what we call spines protruding off of them. And there's been a lot of research into what role these spines play. Are they to enhance the tight packing that occurs in the brain? Do they have some electrophysiological function? Probably a little bit of both. So, pretty hot topic right now that some work is also going on here at the SCIInstitute is connectomics, which is the study of neuronal connectivity. But what we're interested in is how the geometry at a very high resolution affects the connectivity, the graph, and the combinatorics of the connectivity graph. So before we can do any simulation or studies on the geometry, we actually have to model the geometry. And this is complicated by various properties of the data that I'm going to explain in a minute. But we want to model it at various levels. So we want to, at the highest level, we want to model surface meshes or tetrahedral meshes of these geometries. And we want to go all the way down to 1D, what's called cable models, or 1D circuit diagrams, taking into account the geometry of these spines. So this is a model of a dendrite, a 3D mesh that we've produced. And you can see the geometry is interesting, a little bit complicated. The genus is still 0, but you have a lot of branching going on. But as we add in various components, various objects, here the axons are in green, dendrites are in off-white, you see that not only are they interesting geometrically, but their relationship to each other is interesting. They're very tightly packed. As my advisor is wont to say, nature abhors waste, and it doesn't want to waste any space, especially in the brain. So this particular data set is 9 microns cubed. And if we zoom in a little bit here, we can see the cross-section of an axon. Axons typically range in diameter from 100 nanometers to about a micron. And we go even closer, we can see what's called the extracellular space, or the spacing between components in the brain. And that is 100, or 10 nanometers, rather. So you can see there's a lot of anisotropy going on here. We've got very small spaces we want to model. We've got larger spaces we want to model. And how can we do that in a way where we can simulate at all levels? So there are 4 interesting problems that I'll go over today that come out of this project. The first is how to generate the surface meshes. And that's work that we presented at the Symposium for Solid and Physical Modeling a couple years ago and published in CAD. Then I'll talk a little bit about some work I did at the University of Hong Kong last year with Wenping Wang in remeshing and how to remesh surfaces with certain properties. Then a derivation to a 1D model and generating a medial axis between components. Generating a surface mesh from data like this is a very well-studied topic. There are a lot of methods to do it, a lot of real-time methods. Our approach is purely geometric. It works from contours or polygons that are derived from the data. So on the top left, you see a typical electron microscopy image of a cross-section of a rat brain. And our collaborators at the Center for Learning and Memory at UT have traced out the cross-sections of the various neuronal parts, so the dendrites and axons. And that's our starting point. In the lower left, you see how these stack up, the stacks of contours. And what we want to do is we want to interpolate through those contours and fit a surface to them. Lots of work done on this, but we have certain requirements on our mesh. So the left four are properties you would expect pretty much from any meshing algorithm. We want them to be watertight. We want the surface normals to be oriented. We don't want irregularities, and we don't want non-manifold vertices or edges. Non-manifold, this is an example of a non-manifold vertex, where a ball centered at the vertex of arbitrarily small size intersected with the surface doesn't yield a topological disk. We also want topological correctness. So here's a counterexample in the top right where two spines came up and actually merged together. And that actually doesn't happen. So that's an example of an error in topology. I won't be talking about that, but that's one of our requirements in our reconstruction. And then the last three are the ones I'll be talking about. Quality of triangles. Here we have poor quality triangles, and that can affect your solution in your simulation. I'll talk about that in the second problem. In this section, I'll be talking about intersections and how to ensure that we don't have intersections between objects while maintaining our good geometry guarantees. Now, we don't have ground truth for these data other than the polygons that we're given. And so we want to do all of our processing in such a way that we're still interpolating the polygons exactly. And that's what we mean by geometric accuracy in this case. So a lot of rich literature. We take the approach that Bajaj came up in 1996. A lot of work was done leading up to that. And that was kind of the culmination of the geometric approaches in that it gave certain guarantees geometrically and topologically that other approaches only had heuristics for. So we take this approach, and because of the guarantees, we're able to do various things that I'll explain in a minute. Our algorithm is as follows. We take each single component. They're labeled, so we can take all the contours for a given dendrite, all the contours for a given axon, and we fit a surface to each one individually. And then we composite them into the same space. The problem is that when we put them together, in this data, there are a tremendous number of intersections that occur. And that's because, as I mentioned, the spacing between components in plane or in any plane is about 10 nanometers. But because of the physical slicing process or the imaging process, the slices are spaced 45 nanometers apart. So there's very high anisotropy. And since we're linearly interpolating, there's a very high potential for intersections between components. That's taken care of in implicit methods, but there are other issues with implicit methods that our methods avoid. So our approach is to take these intersections and remove them as a post-process. And we do this by finding what we call conflict points, removing them by moving them in the z-axis, where the z-axis is orthogonal to the image plane. And because of the certain properties of our single tiler or our single component reconstruction algorithm, we can make certain guarantees about removing these intersections. Now, you would imagine when you have tightly packed components and you start messing around with the vertices and pulling things apart, there's a good chance that you're going to actually introduce additional intersections with as much as that is going on here. But what we were able to prove is that we can separate them in such a way that not only do we not introduce additional intersections, but we also maintain our interpolation property. And we're not moving the surface away from the original contours. We're not introducing additional surfaces into the image plane. And here are some examples. The left two are to kind of show how it works. The right image is a typical picture of how many intersections are actually occurring. This is a very small portion of the data, and you can see there are all kinds of intersections, and our algorithm takes care of those. One thing we're interested in modeling is the extracellular space, or the dual space, after we've constructed our components. And that it's not well defined when we have intersections. So now that we can remove the intersections, we can actually come up with a model of extracellular space. And it was when we were looking at the extracellular space and trying to improve the triangle quality that we stumbled on this next interesting problem that I'm going to talk about, which is remeshing surfaces where the surfaces, it has portions of surfaces that are flat that approach closely to each other. So surface remeshing is the process of transforming one surface mesh into another surface mesh, and there are various reasons you want to do this. There's decimation. You have too many triangles. That's a common thing to do in both analysis and in computer graphics. You don't have enough time to render your object with 10 million triangles, so you want to decimate it to fewer triangles. And so the literature is very rich with these types of remeshing algorithms, as well as algorithms that improve the triangle quality. One of the algorithms that we've adopted is the centroidal Voronoi tessellation, which is actually similar to spirit as some of the meshing software that's going on here at the SCIIInstitute, I understand. And I'm looking forward to learning more details about that. But the CVT is an algorithm that minimizes an energy function. The energy function is up there. So the idea is sample your space. In the lower left, you see we have sample points. And take the Voronoi diagram. And there's an algorithm for minimizing this function, which is Lloyd's algorithm. And the way it works is you take these the cell, or the Voronoi cell, for a particular sample, and relocate the sample to the center of the cell. And then recompute the Voronoi diagram and do that iteratively. It's actually linear convergence, not the greatest, there are better methods now, but it actually converges to the center image. So you get very nice spacing, you take the dual, and you get a nice Delaunay triangulation. That's what's called a uniform CVT. On the bottom right, you see the results from a non-uniform CVT run, where our density function, or rho, in the energy function is not necessarily 1, where you're weighting the error according to some property of the data. So in our case, well, I'll go to that in a minute. As I discuss this, I talk about both geometric and topological error. So geometric error is how close is our new surface mesh to the original surface mesh. And you can compute the error in various ways, Hausdorff distance, etc. So we want to keep our geometric error low. At the same time, we don't want any topological errors. You see the topological error here is it actually splits the surface, breaks it up, and that's bad. And we want to be able to do both. Now, CVT typically does a very good job of this, but there are certain cases where it doesn't. And the reason is that, well, you can see in the example on the little diagram on the bottom right, we have a surface, and it's approaching another part of the surface that's geodesically very distant, but in Euclidean space, it's very close. And because of that, and because of the way the CVT works, it actually can introduce topological errors. So what CVT does in the context of surface remeshing is it runs some kind of energy minimization algorithm. Then for each sample point on the surface, it takes the Voronoi diagram in 3 dimensions, and then computes the restricted Voronoi cell, which is the intersection of the Voronoi cell with the surface itself. So you see here the C point, its Voronoi cell intersects with two pieces of the surface. So it has two connected components. And because of that, when we take the dual and we triangulate, we're going to get a topological error, as you can see on the top right graphic. The bottom two have a much higher sampling density. And because of that, it actually has topological correctness. The intersection, the restricted Voronoi cell, does not have any more than one connected component in each case. And so we get a proper or a correct topological reconstruction. There are some governing theorems that talk about this. The first I've mentioned is the RVC must be homeomorphic to a topological disk. The second is actually derived from the first. It's a dual theorem, and it comes from the reconstruction from point cloud literature. And it actually states that if you sample with a certain sampling density, then you're guaranteed to get the original surface back. The problem is that the sampling density is determined by the local feature size. The local feature size is a measure of both curvature and how close I am to another part of the surface. So more precisely, it's the distance from a point on the surface to the medial axis, where the medial axis is a set of all points with at least two closest points on the surface. You can see on the bottom left, we have two surfaces. The left one, the red point, has a very large local feature size. It's distant from the medial axis. But the second one, the local feature size is small. And so we're going to have to sample much more densely at that point to get an accurate reconstruction or an accurate remesh. And that's unfortunate because we don't need high sampling at that point. It's got a very low curvature. We should be able to resample that or remesh that area with very, very few triangles or simplices or whatever we're using. So enter our idea, which we call K-CVT. We wanted to use the CVT algorithm, but not using local feature size as the density function, but curvature, which makes a lot more sense. And because we were able to do this, we avoid topological errors in almost every case. So the uniform CVT, as you can see in the horns of the moose, there are very many topological problems. Even with the local feature size as the density function, we have one, and that's because we simply didn't have enough samples allocated. But our algorithm, it uses the exact same number of samples as the other two cases, but avoids all topological errors. So our idea is our approach is to actually segment the surface mesh into separate surface meshes such that any point on the segmented surface mesh, take a ball at that point of radius local feature size, intersect it with a surface, and have a single topological connected component. And by doing this, we then run CVT or remesh each separate mesh individually and then stitch them back together using a greedy stitching algorithm with a cost function on the triangle quality of the stitches. So the results were quite good. We avoid topological errors. As you can see, the bottom right is our result compared to the original mesh, top left, which of course doesn't have topological errors, but the uniform and the local feature size algorithms do introduce topological errors. Yes?
So this is kind of confusing to me. It seems like the local feature size should have better guarantees in your method. And it seemed like it had more points in that region of the mesh, but fewer on the ball, which would be simpler to mesh. So can you explain again why the local feature size technique had an error?
Why it had an error?
Yeah.
Yes, because I think for this example we allocated 4,000 sample points, and for each of the examples, and it didn't have enough sample points in the local feature size example to cover the sampling theorem for the whole mesh, for the whole surface.
But I mean, the strange thing is it looks like there are more samples in the problem area in the local feature size one than in your method, which is in the bottom right. Looks like there's denser in the horn. So you think
that's absolutely true. We have fewer samples, but we avoid topological errors. And that's actually what our goal was. The horns have low curvature, and so we don't want to use so many samples, so many of the triangles on that area, because we don't need many triangles to sample a flat area. And so we want to reallocate those samples to another area of higher curvature. So, for example, if you look at the ball here, there are not very many triangles allocated here, but with ours, we're able to take some from the horns and move them to the areas of higher curvature. Yes?
I'm really confused that the curvature would work at all, because topological is a global property, while a curvature is a very local property. So how can you give an intuition why would curvature make sense? Because to me, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense in what sense?
That because topological statements have nothing to do with local property of the surface. It's a global property to make sure that these things have.
Okay, so I'm speaking topological both locally and globally. So I also, by saying topological correctness, I also mean manifold. And so in the top right image, there's a manifold, a non-manifold vertex. And that's one of the things we're trying to avoid as well.
Yeah, but that's one aspect. But the biggest problem is when you want to maintain a donut topology versus a sphere. I mean, the whole thing has to be.
Okay, so maybe that's the confusion.
It's not enough. I mean,
Yeah. So I guess I should restate that we're actually trying to maintain manifoldness in this case.
Okay, but not the full topology of the.
The full topology, no.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Now, so we maintain manifoldness, and that was our goal. But what we didn't expect was we actually improved geometric accuracy. And that is because we're able, since we use fewer of our allocated samples on these areas of low curvature, we're able to reallocate those samples to areas of high curvature and get better geometric accuracy. So you can see in the first two examples, in the Fermat and the uniform cases, that on the edges of the horns we don't have we don't have enough samples allocated there, and we don't have a lot of great geometric accuracy there. It's a little bit better in the local feature size, but in ours we do have higher allocations in those areas. And so we did a measure of geometric accuracy, and in every case but one, we actually improved the geometric accuracy while driving manifold errors down to 0. Yeah?
Can you give us an idea why not use geodesic distance? I mean, Dijkstra's is really fast, and you only need to compute it up to a local limit. So why not do a Voronoi tessellation on the true geodesic distance defined by your original mesh?
Right. There's actually been some work on using geodesic distance, and it was good. It was slow, and some of the difficulties in actually computing the geodesic distance over the manifold we were able to avoid with our Euclidean approach. Okay, and then just briefly, fish. You can see it maintains the gills on the bottom below the mouth. And I'll skip over this so we can get on to segmentation. Okay, so now we have surface meshes, good quality, according to our requirements. And one of the models that's typically done in electrophysiological simulation is called the cable simulation, a cable model. It's a 1D electrical circuit diagram simulation that you can see on the right hand there. And typically this is done at a much larger scale. So the first experiment was done with a squid axon that's meters long, or a meter long, I think, and it's kind of gone down from there. What we're interested in doing, instead of at the whole cell level, we want to do it at the very local level and take into account the spines, the higher resolution geometries. And so for that, we want to be able to generate automatically our models, our 1D models from our surface meshes that we already have. So we take an approach taken from a paper out of SIGGRAPH in 2008 that was actually done for skeletonization. And so you start with a closed polyhedron, closed surface, iteratively Laplacian smooth it until the triangles are roughly degenerate, and then apply an edge removal algorithm to come up with a 1D model. And one really interesting thing that comes out of this algorithm is we can now map back from the skeleton to the original mesh. And we can map all the triangles that condense down to a single edge in the skeleton and label those as a region. And it turns out that most of these are actually roughly rings around the object. So we use this algorithm to induce this surface segmentation of rings. Now, we've had to do some post-processing. We had to clean it up. Some are not rings. We fix those and fit the interfaces to planes so that we can then have well-defined volumes for each segment. And with those volumes, they're roughly equivalent to a cylinder. We approximate the length. We compute the surface area, approximate the volumes, and we can come up with resistances and capacitances for each segment and plug it into a cable model simulation. And this is submitted with a larger body, in the context of a larger body of work with our software that takes all of these algorithms and packages them into our software tool called VolRover N, and that's in revision right now. Okay, so our current work is to generate a medial axis, or a medial separator between objects. And I apologize, I haven't been able to get the demo up on the screen. Maybe we could try it right now. You don't see it? Okay, then we'll just go back with this. So the idea is we want to be able to model our data with finite elements and run a finite element simulation on it. And we took our data and we took this very small slice of it, small block of it, 1 micron by 1 micron by 100 nanometers. And we ran it through TETGen and produced 125,000 tetrahedra. You integrate that over the entire volume, and you're ending up with many more tetrahedra that you can plug into a finite element solver. And so we can decimate, we can do different things, but we're interested in finding another way to do this. There's been some recent work at UT in meshless methods and embedded surface meshes methods. So the first two methods, the constrained anisotropic triangulation, regardless of the fact it still gives us too many triangles, it also gives ill-conditioned systems because of the quality of the triangles. The constrained quality triangulation gives too many triangles. The meshless methods, the traditional ones, the original ones, use a uniform grid. And we would have to have our grid would have to be too big because of the close spacing of our components to have it be meaningful. And so what we're looking at is producing elements that would be suitable for so-called immersed boundary methods. So what types of elements are we looking at? We have 3 requirements. The polygons are convex so that we can produce generalized barocentric coordinates over them. We want to ensure that the immersed boundaries, the intersection of the boundary with the cell, produces a single connected component. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to target or satisfy the boundary conditions. So in the top left graphic, you can see a cell where intersected with the surface will yield two connected components. That wouldn't work for us. And so the bottom left, it does meet that property. And that's what we're looking for. And you can kind of see the medial axis idea coming out here. We want to align ourselves along the medial axis so that we ensure property number 2 in our resulting cells. So just one more time, the medial axis is the set of all points with at least 2 closest points on the surface. In that graphic, you can see the circles centered on the medial axis with their respective radii, where it has 2 points, 2 closest points. So to compute the medial axis, if we can compute a distance field over the space, then we can just take the critical points, and that will give us a medial axis. And there's a lot of work in volumetric approaches to building a distance field. We take an octree approach, where we're going to build the distance field over an octree structure. And that's because of, again, the anisotropy of the data. Now, there was some nice work done a few years ago where he actually computes an exact distance function over an octree. And that was a nice result. We actually have the same computational complexities in space and time, but our constants are smaller. And we don't have a gradation requirement. The work before had a gradation requirement where 2 adjacent cells had to be within at least 1 level, octree level of each other, and we have no such requirement. So what do I mean by building a distance function over an octree? We start with various objects, in this case 2 squares and 2 triangles. And we're going to build an octree on top of those, quadtree in 2 dimensions, which is a spatial decomposition. And there are various stopping criteria that you can use where you want to stop. And then for every vertex on the octree that is part of a cell that contains the surface, we compute the exact distance function, or we compute the exact distance to the surface. And so that's order n in the number of simplices in the mesh to compute all of those. And then we take a Dijkstra's algorithm, an algorithm inspired by Dijkstra's shortest cost path algorithm, where we expand a wavefront and compute the distances on each of the vertices of the octree. And one nice thing about this is, since we're maintaining labels, we're maintaining a label on each vertex of what object it belongs to. And so for each label, we're not going to have to search through the entire space and compute a distance function. So for example, for this vertex here, we're not going to have to compute the distance to each of the other objects, which would be rather expensive. But when the wavefronts of each of the labels meet, one wins out and continues on, and the other one stops. And so what we end up with is a label on each vertex corresponding to whichever object it's closest to, as well as an approximate point that's in the proximate region of the actual closest point on that component. Okay, so this is not an exact algorithm. It's approximate, but we have conjectured that the error bound of the actual true distance on a vertex is within that constant times alpha, where alpha is defined as the distance from a vertex to its closest vertex neighbor. And we're just finishing up the proof to that now. So once we have the distance field computed, we just take every edge that has differing labels on its vertices and compute where we approximate the medial axis to pass through on that edge, which we do by taking the 2 points on each of the 2 components, 1 point on the triangle on the left and 1 point on the yellow square on the right, growing circles out from there, finding the intersection of the circles with the edge, and call that the critical point. And once we have those, we can compute the medial axis. Now, you can see that this particular example has problems because topologically it's ambiguous for some cells. So in the bottom right-hand cell, we have 5 intersections along the boundary of the cell. And so how do we compute, or how do we connect those medial axes? We can't just tile to the center like we do. So in those cases, we just decompose further in the cells of ambiguity until the ambiguity is resolved. So this is an example in 2 dimensions. I'm sorry I can't show a live demo, but it's real time. You draw the objects, and it computes the medial axis. On the right, you can see that it takes care naturally of non-manifold surfaces. So the blue has self-intersections. It takes care of embedded surfaces. So you have a surface inside a surface, and it will just as easily compute the separator between those, and as well as intersecting surfaces. In 3 dimensions, which is our target space, in this example we have 2 dendrites with a combined total of 45,000 triangles, and it computed 2,000 triangles in the medial sheet. And we computed down to octree level 12. In this case, we had to go down 12 levels in order to get a true separation, because these actually, the dendrites actually approach each other very closely, and this is a true separator. It took about 17 seconds on a standard desktop. This example we didn't compute as low. It only went down to octree level 8. The combined total of input triangles, 125,000, 83,000 triangles in the medial sheet, and it took 4 seconds on my desktop. You'll notice that the medial sheet is not manifold, which makes sense by definition, and it yields some pretty interesting things. So you can see the blue axon coming through, and it actually has the tunnel. It encloses the axon completely in a tunnel to separate it from the other components. So in our little way, we're hoping to contribute to the Connectomics project by looking at how geometry affects the connectivity of neurons in the brain. And doing this at a geometric level is looking very promising. We can produce the surface meshes, we can produce the 1D models. We're making our ways into producing these other types of elements for other types of analysis, and we've got big hopes for those. So in the future, we need to finish up our convex polyhedra work to produce these new types of cells. And then we want to look at a multi-scale type simulation. We're going to have these models suitable for simulations at different scales. Is there a way we can couple these simulations together so that we can model something at a very high resolution or low level, maybe the ion diffusion level, while allowing other parts of the space to affect it through other types of simulation, maybe a coarser simulation like a 1D cable model simulation. And if we can couple those, that may give us some insight into both global and local effects and how they influence each other. But that requires coupling of the equations, and that's what we're interested in looking at next. Thank you very much.